bottle was empty again. Dr. Elias Vance held it up to the weak afternoon light filtering through his apartment's yellowed blinds, watching dust motes dance in the amber glass. Nothing. He'd sworn yesterday would be the last time, the same promise he'd made every morning for 3 years. The bottle clattered into the recycling bin, joining 24 identical soldiers of his slow defeat. His hands trembled as he ran them through unwashed hair. The tremor was worse today. He'd need another bottle before nightfall, before the shaking became unbearable, before the memories became too sharp. The apartment smelled of stale cigarettes and failure. Takeout containers formed archaeological layers on the coffee table, marking time in a way his broken wall clock no longer could. 3:15 or 7:30, it didn't matter. Time had lost meaning the day he stopped being a surgeon and became just another drunk with a medical degree gathering dust in a drawer. 5 years. 5 years since his hands had been steady enough to hold a scalpel. 5 years since Emma Reeves had died on his operating table. Vance pressed his palms against his eyes until colors bloomed in the darkness. The pressure helped sometimes, pushing the images back down into the black knot that lived in his chest. It had weight, that knot. Physical, tangible weight. Some mornings he could barely stand upright beneath it, as if someone had sewn a bowling ball into his ribcage. He made it to the bathroom, splashed water on his face. The mirror showed a stranger, gaunt and gray, eyes sunken into bruised sockets. 43 years old and looking 20 years older. The stranger stared back with hollow accusation. Emma had been 7, a routine appendectomy. He'd done hundreds of them, could perform the procedure in his sleep. Except that morning he'd been hungover, his hands not quite steady, his focus fractured. One small nick in the wrong place, one tiny error. The bleeding had been catastrophic, unsurvivable. He could still hear the flat line, that endless monotone scream of the heart monitor. The hospital review board had been surprisingly merciful. Mistakes happened, complications arose. They'd found no evidence of impairment, though they'd suspected. He'd been good at hiding it then. But Vance knew. He knew exactly what he'd done, and no administrative absolution could touch the knowledge that lived in his bones. He'd surrendered his license 6 months later. Couldn't trust himself anymore. Couldn't risk another Emma. The knot in his chest pulsed, a dull ache that never quite faded. It grew heavier when he drank, but the alcohol made it possible to breathe around it. A trade he'd made peace with, even as it killed him by degrees. Evening came, as it always did. Vance made a half-hearted attempt at eating, forcing down 3 bites of cold Chinese food before his stomach rebelled. The walls of his apartment seemed to press inward as darkness gathered in the corners. He thought about calling his sister, who still tried to reach out once a month. He thought about calling his sponsor from the AA meetings he'd stopped attending. He thought about a lot of things he would never do. Instead, he sat on the couch and stared at nothing. That's when the smell came. It arrived gradually, seeping under the door like fog. Old blood, the copper penny reek of it, mixed with the astringent bite of hospital-grade antiseptic. The combination triggered something primal in his surgeon's memory, yanking him back to 100 operating rooms, 1,000 procedures. His heart rate spiked, the knot in his chest constricted. Vance stood, legs unsteady, and moved toward the door. He hadn't ordered food, hadn't invited anyone. The smell grew stronger, thick enough to taste, coating his throat with phantom viscera. He looked through the peepholes. The hallway was empty. The smell intensified, now coming from inside the apartment. Vance spun, searching his cramped living room. Nothing. No one. But the air had changed, become heavy, expectant. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in as many seconds. His breath misted. It materialized in the corner, where the shadows were thickest. First came the suggestion of a shape, a darkness slightly denser than the surrounding gloom. Then details emerged, as if reality was slowly remembering something it had tried to forget. Tall, impossibly thin, folded into the angle where the walls met. Its skin was the color of old parchment, stretched drum-tight over a framework of too many joints. The limbs bent in places they shouldn't, creating a geometry that hurt to look at. But the face, God, the face. Where eyes should have been, there was only smooth skin, as if the creature had been born without sockets. Yet it was looking at him. Vance felt its eyeless gaze like pressure against his skull, probing, searching. Its mouth was a lipless gash, too wide, lined with what looked like surgical needles instead of teeth. Hundreds of them, gleaming silver, each one perfectly sterile and sharp. Vance couldn't move, couldn't scream. His legs had become lead, his voice trapped behind the knot in his chest, which had suddenly grown to crushing weight. The thing unfolded from the corner, its movements fluid and wrong, like a film played backward. It made no sound as it crossed the room, its two long fingers trailing along the wall. Up close, it was even more horrible. The smell of blood and antiseptic rolled off it in waves, so strong Vance gagged. When it spoke, the voice came from everywhere and nowhere, bypassing his ears entirely and manifesting directly in his mind. "I can taste it," the thing said. Its needle mouth didn't move. "The heavy thing you carry, the black knot, it's crushing you." Vance found his voice, though it emerged as barely a whisper. "What are you? Does it matter?" The creature tilted its head, an oddly bird-like gesture made horrifying by its alien proportions. "You know why I'm here. You've been calling for me, though you didn't know it. Every time you pressed your hand to your chest, every time you begged for the weight to lift. I heard." The thing moved closer. Vance could see now that its skin wasn't quite solid, that it seemed to shimmer at the edges, as if it existed only partially in his reality. Up close, the needles in its mouth were even more disturbing. They glinted with something that might have been saliva or might have been something else entirely, something that reflected light and colors that shouldn't exist. "I can take it from you," it said. "The guilt, the remorse, the crushing weight of what you've done. I can eat it, consume it, make it go away. You could be free, Elias, free for the first time in 5 years." The offer hung in the air between them, terrible and tempting in equal measure. Vance's heart hammered against his ribs. Part of him, the rational part that remembered medical school and the scientific method, screamed that this was impossible. Hallucination, alcohol withdrawal, a psychotic break. But the larger part, the part that had lived with the knot for so long, didn't care about explanations. It only knew that something was offering relief from an unbearable burden. "How?" His voice cracked. The creature's needle mouth stretched into something that might have been a smile. "You know how. You can feel it, can't you? The knot, where it lives." Vance's hand moved involuntarily to his chest, pressing against his sternum. Yes, he could feel it, had always felt it. A solid mass of guilt and shame and horror lodged somewhere between his heart and lungs, choking him slowly. "I have to touch it," the creature said. "Put my mouth to your chest. Let me in. It will hurt, but only for a moment, and then you'll be light again, clean, free." Every instinct screamed at him to run, to fight, to do anything but agree to this. But Vance was so tired, so crushingly, devastatingly tired. 5 years of carrying the weight, 5 years of seeing Emma's face every time he closed his eyes, 5 years of drowning one bottle at a time. "Will it kill me?" he asked. No. The thing moved closer still, until Vance could feel cold radiating from its impossible skin. Death would be too easy. This is about living, living without the burden. Vance closed his eyes, nodded once. The creature moved with sudden speed, closing the distance between them in a motion too fast to track. Its long fingers wrapped around Vance's shoulders, grip firm but not painful. The smell of blood and antiseptic became overwhelming, suffocating. Vance gasped, tried to pull away, but the thing held him steady. "Be still," it whispered directly into his mind. "Let me work." The needle-filled mouth lowered to Vance's chest, pressing against his shirt, against his skin beneath. He felt each individual point make contact, hundreds of tiny pricks creating a circle over his heart. The needles were cold, so cold they burned. Then they pushed through. Not through his skin, not physically, but through something else, some layer of reality that Vance hadn't known existed. The needles sank into that impossible space where the knot lived, the black mass of guilt that had no physical form but still had weight and substance. The pain was exquisite. It felt like the creature was pulling barbed wire through his chest cavity, like every nerve was being plucked like guitar strings. Vance screamed, but no sound emerged. His body locked rigid, every muscle contracting at once. Tears streamed down his face. His heart stuttered, skipped beats, raced. And then came the pulling. The creature was drinking from him, drawing the guilt up through those needle teeth like venom from a wound. Vance could feel the black knot shifting, loosening, being torn apart strand by strand. Each piece that came free brought a wave of sensation, memory, and emotion crashing through him. Emma's face, her mother's screams, the blood, the flatline, the funeral he'd watched from his car, too cowardly to attend, the bottle, the first drink, the 100th, the 1000th, every moment of the last 5 years, every decision that had led him here, all of it being pulled out through his chest. The creature drank deeply, its throat working, needle teeth buried in the metaphysical space over Vance's heart. He could hear it feeding, a wet, sucking sound that made his stomach heave. Could feel his guilt, his remorse, his crushing shame being consumed, swallowed, digested by something that existed to eat such things. The relief, when it came, was obscene. As the knot dissolved, lightness flooded in to replace it. The weight that had lived in his chest for 5 years simply ceased to exist. Vance gasped, actually gasped, as his lungs expanded fully for the first time in forever. His heart beat steady and strong, no longer laboring under impossible pressure. The creature pulled back, withdrawing its needle teeth from his chest. Where they'd been, Vance felt nothing. No pain, no wound, not even a memory of puncture. Just emptiness. Blessed, horrible emptiness. He staggered backward, hands clutching at his chest, feeling for the knot that was no longer there. Gone. It was gone. The guilt, the remorse, the crushing weight of Emma's death, all of it simply erased, as if it had never existed. The creature watched him with its eyeless face, needle mouth glistening with something dark and viscous. When it spoke again, its voice carried a note of satisfaction. "How do you feel?" Vance laughed. He couldn't help it. Laughter bubbled up from somewhere deep inside, manic and relieved and utterly unhinged. Light. I feel light. Oh God, I can breathe. I can actually breathe. "Yes," the creature said. "The burden is mine now. I've taken it from you, consumed it. You're free." It was already fading, dissolving back into the shadows from which it had emerged. The smell of blood and antiseptic diminished. The temperature rose. Within seconds, the thing was gone, leaving Vance alone in his apartment. He stood there, breathing hard, hands still pressed to his chest, waiting for the guilt to return, for the knot to reform. But it didn't. His chest remained clear, empty, light. For the first time in 5 years, when he thought of Emma Reeves, he felt nothing. No horror, no shame, no crushing remorse, just a distant, clinical memory of a surgical error, a thing that had happened, a mistake made, nothing more. Vance laughed again, louder this time. He felt drunk, euphoric, flying. He paced his apartment, marveling at how easy it was to move, to stand upright, to exist without the constant weight. He caught sight of himself in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the face looking back. Still gaunt, still worn, but different somehow. The eyes were clear. The stranger was gone. He didn't sleep that night, too wired, too amazed by the absence of burden. He cleaned his apartment, actually cleaned it, throwing away the takeout containers and empty bottles, opened the windows to let in fresh air, found his medical journals, buried under months of neglect, and flipped through them with something approaching interest. Dawn came, painting his apartment in shades of gold and pink. Vance made coffee, real coffee, not the instant sludge he'd been surviving on. He showered, shaved, put on clean clothes, looked at himself in the mirror and saw someone who might, possibly, rejoin the world. He turned on the television for the first time in weeks, more for background noise than anything else. The morning news played, the anchors discussing weather and traffic with practiced cheer. Then the breaking news alert. The anchor's expressions shifted, becoming grave. The screen cut to a hospital, ambulances and police cars filling the parking lot. A reporter stood outside, microphone in hand, face pale. "We're here at Mercy General Hospital, where just hours ago a tragic incident occurred during what should have been a routine surgery. Details are still emerging, but we've learned that a 7-year-old girl undergoing an appendectomy suffered catastrophic complications when the surgeon accidentally nicked a major blood vessel. Despite efforts to save her, the child was pronounced dead at the scene. Hospital officials have released a statement expressing their deepest condolences to the family and announcing a full investigation into the incident." The coffee cup slipped from Vance's hand, shattering on the floor. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The reporter continued talking, but the words became white noise beneath the roaring in his ears. The screen cut to file footage of the surgeon being escorted from the hospital, face hidden behind his hands. Then to a photo of the girl, smiling, alive, her whole life ahead of her. 7 years old, dark hair, brown eyes. She looked like Emma. No, that wasn't right. She didn't look like Emma. But the circumstances were identical. Routine appendectomy, 7 years old, surgical error, nicked blood vessel, catastrophic bleeding, dead. Exactly what had happened to Emma. Exactly. Vance's legs gave out. He collapsed to his knees among the broken coffee cup, hands pressed to his chest, to the space where the knot had been, where the guilt had lived. The reporter was interviewing the girl's father now, a man destroyed, barely able to speak through his tears. She was healthy. She was fine. It was supposed to be simple. They said it was simple, and now she's gone. Our baby is gone. Understanding crashed over Vance like a wave of ice water. The creature hadn't destroyed his guilt, hadn't erased it. It had moved it, transferred it, given it to someone else. Another surgeon was now living with the weight of a dead child on his hands. Another family was shattered. Another girl was dead, killed by the same mistake, the same error. The guilt hadn't been consumed. It had been recycled, fed back into the world, creating a perfect echo of the tragedy that had destroyed Vance's life. His mistake had happened again. Because he'd given it away, because he'd refused to carry the burden. Vance pressed his hands harder against his chest, searching desperately for the knot, for the weight, for the crushing guilt that had lived there for 5 years. But there was nothing, just emptiness, just the horrible, obscene lightness of being. He tried to feel remorse, tried to force himself to care, to grieve, to be crushed by what had happened. But he couldn't. The guilt was gone. The creature had taken it, and now Vance was incapable of feeling the appropriate horror at what his relief had cost. He knew, intellectually, that this was monstrous, that a child was dead because of him, because of his weakness, his desperate need to be free of his burden. He knew it was his fault, as surely as Emma's death had been his fault, more so because this time he'd chosen it. He'd let the creature take the guilt, and this was the price. But he couldn't feel it. Couldn't access the emotions that should have been tearing him apart. He was empty where the guilt should have been, and the emptiness was worse than any weight could ever be. Vance stared at the television screen, at the girl's smiling photo, at her father's destroyed face. He tried to cry, couldn't. Tried to feel the crushing remorse, couldn't. He was free of the burden, exactly as the creature had promised. Free and hollow, and more damned than he'd ever been before. The news moved on to other stories, traffic, weather, sports. The world continued spinning, indifferent to one more tragedy, one more dead child, one more family destroyed. Vance remained on his knees among the broken coffee cup, hands pressed to his empty chest, unable to feel what he knew he should feel. The bottle under his sink called to him. He could hear it, promising oblivion, promising to fill the emptiness with something, anything, even if it was just numbness. His hands shook as he stood, as he moved toward the kitchen. But even drinking held no appeal now. The alcohol had been a way to dull the guilt, to make the weight bearable. Without the guilt, there was nothing to dull, just emptiness, just the hollow knowledge of what he'd done, what he'd caused, without the emotional capacity to properly process it. He was broken in a new way now, not crushed by the weight of remorse, but evacuated of it. A shell hollowed out, incapable of the redemptive suffering that might have eventually allowed him to heal. Vance returned to the living room, to the television still playing its endless cycle of news. He sat on his couch and watched the world continue without him, feeling nothing, unable to feel anything, condemned to carry the knowledge of his actions without the burden of appropriate guilt. The creature had kept its promise. He was free. And freedom, he now understood, was its own kind of hell. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of artificial normalcy. Vance went through the motions of living, a puppet mimicking humanity. He ate when he should eat, slept when he should sleep, showered and dressed, and maintained the basic functions of existence. But inside, there was only the emptiness. He followed the news obsessively, learning everything about the girl. Her name was Sophie Chen. She'd loved drawing and gymnastics. She'd been afraid of the dark but brave about the surgery, had told her parents not to worry. The surgeon, Dr. Marcus Webb, had been with Mercy General for 12 years. Spotless record, respected, competent, until he wasn't. The hospital's investigation revealed nothing conclusive. A tragic accident, complications. These things happened, rare as they were. Dr. Webb had been cleared of gross negligence, but had nonetheless surrendered his license. The last photo Vance found showed a man who looked exactly as Vance had looked 5 years ago, hollow-eyed and destroyed, the weight of a child's death crushing him from the inside. Webb had the knot now, the black mass of guilt and shame and horror. He would carry it, as Vance had carried it, as countless others before them had carried their own versions. The burden had been passed on, the guilt recycled, the suffering distributed. Vance tried to care, tried to manufacture the appropriate emotional response. Sat in his apartment and recited the facts to himself. A child is dead because of you. You chose relief over responsibility. You let a creature steal your guilt, and it found someone else to give it to. You are responsible. You are guilty. You should feel remorse. But he didn't, couldn't. The capacity for that feeling had been excised along with the knot itself. He was a man trying to bleed without veins, trying to cry without tear ducts. The mechanics of guilt had been removed, leaving only the intellectual understanding of its absence. 3 weeks after Sophie Chen's death, Vance received a letter. No return address, no postmark. It was simply there one morning, slipped under his door while he slept. Inside, a single sheet of paper with a single sentence written in handwriting that seemed to shift and change as he looked at it. The burden always finds a home. Vance stared at the words until they lost meaning, until they became just shapes on paper. He understood what it meant. The guilt would keep moving, being passed from person to person, creating tragedy after tragedy. An endless cycle of suffering, all because he'd been too weak to carry his own burden. He thought about finding Dr. Webb, trying to explain. But what would he say? That a supernatural creature had stolen his guilt and given it to someone else? That Sophie's death was connected to Emma's by invisible threads of transferred remorse? He'd sound insane. Maybe he was insane. Maybe the creature had never existed. Maybe he'd had a psychotic break and the timing with Sophie's death was coincidence. But deep in his hollow chest, where the knot had lived, Vance knew the truth. Knew it with absolute certainty. The creature was real. The transaction had occurred, and he was responsible for everything that followed. The Foundation found him on a Tuesday. 2 people in suits appeared at his door, credentials identifying them as federal agents, though the organization name meant nothing to him. They were polite but firm. They had questions about his experience, about the night 3 weeks ago. They knew about the creature, called it SCP-7189. Vance let them in, too emptied out to be surprised or afraid. They sat in his living room with recording devices and notepads, asking careful questions. How had it appeared? What had it said? What had it done? How did he feel afterward? He told them everything. What did he have to lose? They listened without judgment, taking notes, asking for clarifications. They seemed unsurprised by every detail, as if such things were routine for them. We've documented 43 confirmed encounters with SCP-7189, one of them said. Her name was Agent Morrison, mid-40s, gray eyes that had seen too much. Yours fits the pattern. The entity manifests to individuals experiencing profound guilt or remorse. It offers to remove the emotional burden. Those who accept always report the same sensation of lightness, of relief. And the transfer? Vance's voice was flat. Does it always create a new tragedy? Morrison and her partner exchanged glances. Not always immediately, but within days or weeks, yes. Someone else experiences a nearly identical situation to what created the guilt in the first place. The burden moves, the suffering propagates. How do I get it back? Vance leaned forward. The guilt. How do I take it back from Dr. Webb? You can't. The other agent, Thompson, younger but with the same worn expression, shook his head. Once SCP-7189 completes the transfer, it's permanent. Dr. Webb carries your guilt now. You carry nothing. Then what's the point of you being here? Anger flared, the first real emotion Vance had felt since the creature's visit. If you can't help, if you can't fix this, why are you here? Documentation, Morrison said simply. Understanding. We're trying to determine SCP-7189's origin, its purpose, its limitations. Each testimony helps, and we're here to warn you. Warn me about what? The emptiness you feel isn't permanent. Thompson pulled out a file, flipped it open. We've tracked previous subjects. After the guilt is removed, there's a period of hollow functioning, exactly what you're experiencing. But eventually, the mind tries to compensate. It knows something should be there. The absence becomes its own kind of torment. Many subjects attempt to fill the void through increasingly extreme actions, trying to generate new guilt, new remorse, something to replace what was taken. Morrison continued. Of our 43 documented cases, 17 subjects have died within 6 months. Suicide, mostly. 14 are in psychiatric facilities. 8 have committed serious crimes, we believe in an attempt to recreate the feeling they lost. Only 4 have achieved anything resembling normal function, and even they report persistent emptiness, an inability to connect with appropriate emotional responses. Vance sat back, the information settling over him like ash. So I'm just broken now, permanently. You made a choice, Morrison said, not unkindly. SCP-7189 doesn't force the transfer, it offers. You accepted. I didn't know what it would cost. No one ever does. That's part of the entity's nature. It presents the offer as purely beneficial, relief without consequence. But there's always a consequence. The guilt has to go somewhere. They stayed another hour, documenting every detail Vance could remember. Before they left, Morrison gave him a card with a phone number. If SCP-7189 appears again, if you experience any unusual phenomena, call immediately, and if you're thinking of harming yourself or others, call this number instead. A second card, this one for a crisis hotline. After they left, Vance sat alone in his apartment, staring at the cards. The Foundation knew about the creature, had documented it, studied it, which meant there were others like him. 43 confirmed cases, 43 people who'd been crushed by guilt and had accepted the creature's offer. 43 transfers, 43 new tragedies created. How many more that weren't confirmed? How many encounters throughout history? How much suffering had been propagated by people too weak to carry their own burdens? How much suffering had he personally created? Sophie Chen, dead because of him. Dr. Marcus Webb, destroyed because of him. And the cycle would continue, wouldn't it? Webb would carry the guilt until he couldn't anymore, until maybe he got desperate enough, broken enough, that he called out into the void the same way Vance had. And the creature would come to him, would offer him relief. And if Webb accepted, another tragedy would occur. Another child would die. Another surgeon would be destroyed. On, forever, the guilt recycling through the world, creating suffering wherever it landed. Vance pressed his hands to his empty chest, tried again to feel remorse, tried to access the guilt that should have been eating him alive. But there was nothing, just the hollow knowledge of his responsibility, the intellectual understanding of his failure, without the emotional weight to make it real. The bottle under the sink still called to him, but for different reasons now. Not to dull the guilt, but to fill the emptiness. To feel something, anything, even if it was just the burn of alcohol and the slow dissolution of consciousness. He resisted. Barely. If he started drinking again, he'd never stop. Would end up one of the 17 dead within 6 months, or one of the 14 institutionalized. The Foundation's statistics offered a grim roadmap of his possible futures. Instead, he did something he hadn't done in 5 years. He opened his laptop, navigated to the State Medical Board website, and looked up the requirements for license reinstatement. It was a long shot. His surrender had been voluntary, but his reputation was destroyed. Getting back into medicine would require evaluations, references, proof of rehabilitation. But what else did he have? The emptiness would kill him eventually, one way or another. Maybe helping people, saving lives, could fill some of the void. It wouldn't be redemption, he knew that. Couldn't feel redemption without the capacity for guilt. But it might be something. Purpose, perhaps. A way to exist in the hollow shell he'd become. He started making notes, steps he'd need to take, people he'd need to contact. It was mechanical, clinical, the same methodical approach he'd once brought to surgery. No passion, no hope, just the execution of a plan, because the alternative was dissolution. Weeks passed, then months. Vance worked toward reinstatement with robotic determination. He attended AA meetings, though he didn't drink anymore and couldn't feel the guilt and shame that usually drove people there. He saw a therapist, lying about his symptoms, presenting the appearance of recovery. He studied, updating his knowledge, preparing for evaluations. The emptiness remained, a constant hollow in his chest where the knot had been. He functioned around it, learned to mimic appropriate emotional responses, smiled when expected, expressed concern when required, played the role of a man healing from trauma, when really he was just a shell going through motions. He thought about Sophie Chen every day, about Dr. Webb, whose life he'd destroyed, about Emma Reeves, the original sin that had started everything. He thought about them and knew he should feel crushing remorse, and felt nothing, and the absence of feeling was its own kind of torture. The Foundation checked in periodically. Morrison called once a month, asking if he'd experienced any unusual phenomena. If SCP-7189 had returned, it hadn't. The creature had taken what it wanted and moved on, leaving Vance to live with the consequences. 6 months after the creature's visit, Vance received notification that his petition for license reinstatement would be reviewed. A small victory, hollow as everything else. He prepared his case, gathered his documentation, presented himself before the board as a man who had faced his demons and emerged stronger. They believed him. Or at least they saw someone who looked functional, who had completed all the required steps, who seemed stable. The restrictions were heavy, supervised practice only, regular evaluations, but it was a start. His first day back in a hospital felt like wearing a dead man's clothes. The familiar smells, the sounds, the controlled chaos of medical practice. It should have felt like coming home. Instead, it felt like haunting a place he no longer belonged. But he could do the work. His hands were steady now, steadier than they'd been in years. Without the crushing guilt, without the weight of the knot, he could focus completely on the mechanical aspects of medicine. He was a better technician now, cold and precise, untroubled by emotion. His supervising physician praised his steady nerves. His patients recovered well. He saved lives with the same hollow competence he brought to everything else. And at night, he returned to his apartment and sat in the dark and pressed his hands to his empty chest and tried to feel something about the lives he'd saved, tried to feel satisfaction or pride or purpose. But there was nothing, just the mechanical understanding that he'd performed his function adequately. The emptiness never filled. 1 year after the creature's visit, Vance was performing a supervised appendectomy, routine procedure. The patient was a young girl, 8 years old. Not 7, not identical to Emma or Sophie, but close enough that he knew this moment was significant. His hands were perfectly steady as he made the incision, perfectly steady as he navigated the familiar territory of the procedure. No tremor, no hesitation, no fear. The absence of guilt made him fearless, made him precise, made him exactly the kind of surgeon he'd always wanted to be. The procedure went perfectly. The girl recovered without complication. Her parents thanked him with tears in their eyes, grateful for his skill, his steady hands, his competence. Vance accepted their thanks with a smile he didn't feel, and returned to his hollow apartment and sat in the dark and understood, finally, the true nature of what the creature had done to him. It hadn't freed him. It had broken him, turned him into something that could function but couldn't live. He would go on like this, empty and competent, saving lives without being able to feel the meaning of it, existing without the capacity for the emotions that made existence worthwhile. The guilt would have killed him eventually, yes. The weight of Emma's death had been unsustainable, but at least it had been real. At least he'd been human, capable of remorse, capable of suffering, capable of the emotional responses that connected him to his actions. Now he was just a machine wearing human skin, functional, empty. Damned not by the weight of guilt, but by its absence. He pressed his hands to his chest one more time, searching for the knot that would never return, and finally understood that some burdens were meant to be carried. That the weight of our mistakes, crushing as it might be, was part of what made us human. That in trying to escape his guilt, he'd lost something far more essential than comfort. He'd lost himself. And somewhere out there, Dr. Marcus Webb carried the burden that should have been Vance's, crushed by a guilt that wasn't originally his, probably calling out into the void the same way Vance once had. And the creature would hear, would come, would offer relief, and the cycle would continue. The guilt would keep moving, creating tragedy after tragedy, because people like Vance were too weak to carry what they'd done. Because the creature existed to feed on that weakness, to offer impossible relief at terrible cost. Vance turned off the lights and lay down in his empty apartment and stared at the ceiling and felt nothing and knew he would feel nothing forever. This was his punishment, worse than any weight could have been. To live without the capacity for remorse, to exist in the hollow space where his humanity had been, to know what he'd lost and be unable to mourn it. The burden always finds a home, the letter had said. And Vance had learned too late that the home it was meant to find was the one who earned it, that some weights were meant to be carried, that in refusing his burden, he'd become something worse than crushed. He'd become empty, and the emptiness, he now knew, would never end.